Let's go over very quickly about the concept art for this character. I had these very old sketches I kind of liked, and I thought they would look cool sculpted in 3D. The second one has something else going for it. I thought it looked kind of original, and I think it's the ugly nose that kind of makes him look like me. But anyway, after choosing the character I was going with, I needed some references. That's when I came across this guy's work, Cedric. He did all the concept art for the characters of Dishonored. They look amazing. I love how faceted they look. They look pretty rough, very serious, had a lot of detail, a lot of personality. Look at this guy, it's hilarious. It's all broken. It's great. I also had some sculpting references. This one is for Rango. I like the dense kind of details that it has. Look at this, even the cloth looks great. Loved all of this. Next was the shading references. I needed something that kind of looked realistic, but not quite. Maybe this one is too realistic. The other ones look quite stylized, even shading wise. I guess the shapes, they help a lot. So with all this, I started doing some sketches. You can see that the last one is obviously the best. I guess the hand starts getting loose and loose with repetition. So I picked this one. I cleaned it up. I did some color schemes. I think most of them look a little bit too dark now that I see it again. But anyway, all of this helped me to get into this point. Well, I decided this color scheme, it kind of changed a bit with time. It also is pretty dark in these tones, so it is a starting point, and then it started getting improving a little bit. So with all this, I jumped into ZBrush to do a base sculpt. Obviously, the body doesn't have the same level of detail. We're gonna get into that later. More details on the hands and the head. The whole body was gonna be covered in cloth, so as you can see, I didn't pay much attention to most of the details in the body. And yeah, in the next minutes we're gonna see how we reach this final character. This is what it looks like, the final. So yeah, we'll see how we get in here. Jumping into the sculpts now, I tried to maintain as much as I could from the original concept. I think the challenge in here was try to figure out what the body would look like underneath the cloth. So later on, when we simulate cloth on the top, things would stay kind of, well, not sure if the same, but it relate to it, trying to keep the important parts. There is a caveat on the poses that we do in 2D that we don't always, well, at least for me, I don't know what they're gonna look like on the side. So this one ended up having like a big curvature, trying to keep the same attitude. But anyway, I think it turned out all right. As you can see, we can close up a little bit. There's not a lot of detail still on the head or on the hands. Later on, I think I shrink a little bit the hands. They're a little bit too big, especially also according to the sketch. But overall, I thought it was working just fine. So I then jumped into the next phase. In this case, start detailing the head and the hands. Now, jumping into the head, this is the very first version I did. I'm looking down some shapes and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't in 3D, as opposed to the 2D concept. I thought that the eyelids were a little bit too heavy, and there's a few things that I didn't keep. You can see some of the cheekbones were a little bit too much, and also the direction of the beard, as it was pointy, was going way too forward. So with all that in mind, I jumped it into new versions. This was the next version I did for the head. Maybe there was a few in betweens, but this one was the other important one. You can see that I lost a few of the very, very pronounced cheekbones. I still wanted to keep this curve in here. So you can see this one is not going so much inside, but it will still have this nice kind of rhythm in there and the curve going in. The next version, I think I got rid of most of the things I did in here. Way too many details in the pores. It was a little bit too much in your face for this kind of details, but still helps to see what works and what doesn't. I believe with this one, I already started trying to get these faceted kind of details here and there that you can see, and they're a little bit polished. And for the final version of the sculpt, I went these routes. So you can see I still kept some of the curves and the ins and outs that I liked. You can see that the skin is not very uniform. There's some patches here and there. I got rid later of this card. It was a little bit too much. There are some smaller details like in the lips, and you can see that every protuberance that has a certain threshold, it starts to get faceted, and that's what I wanted to get from the original Cedric references. I think that's what kind of worked for the model, and this is what I actually got to see almost for the first time when I looked at your profile, because I never drew one or even the front. So yeah, that's pretty much how the sculpt for the head ended up. So finally, the other important part of the sculpting for this character were the hands. I had, if you remember from the original body, a very simple blocked hands in there with no detail, and also they were posed. So what I did was I grabbed this geometry, I put it kind of in pose like a T pose, more like an A pose actually, because it's kind of looking down. And I opened the fingers. So what I did was sculpt a single finger, then duplicated them and started sculpting each one of them separately so they have a bit of variation. So we don't see that they are all exactly the same basically. And after that I had an initial structure that I could work on and start looking for shapes where you can see all the knuckles are pretty square. The tips of the finger are wider than the base. I thought that was going to give him a little bit of character. I would imagine. I actually see that more in bass players than in guitar players, but still, they start having like the tip of the fingers overdeveloped because they are using it all the time. It's actually pretty funny for some of them. And then I started looking for all that faceted looking everywhere I could include it. Just edges and volumes and all of that. Make those transitions a little bit sharper, and then apply a bit of polish everywhere so all those details would come up. I think I shrink the wrist a little bit because it's a little bit too wide in here and it doesn't look like it has one. But yeah, we're gonna see all of that a little bit on the part of the actual modeling with the topology and everything. Sometimes you have to find a little bit of a compromise so everything works together with the character and the rig and the geometry and all of that. Let's dive into Katana for a while to see how I went about the whole look dev of the character. The template is pretty simple. It doesn't have anything too special. We have the normal input, which is this all Alembic imports, the groom on the other side. We're gonna leave the groom for later. In this case, I have this broom just because I don't need to see the guitar to finish up with the character itself. In this section, I just left it so I could copy the UVs from another Alembic. This is useful because if you actually need to modify the UVs for whatever reason, let's say you just found something stretching pretty badly and you fixed it, then you can just copy the UVs to the actual animated geometries and you don't have to re-export everything later, right? And all this section is for shaders, and here below, well, this is where the look file publish ends, right? And after that, I have a few custom layer setups, a gaffer, crypto, and all these setups, AOV manager, and there is this little note in here that automatically create all the light groups. So I'm gonna show you a macro that I created that helps me to go about the look dev very quickly. So this is the current state of the character. Let's just assume that all the textures are done. The cloth is done, all the modeling is done, and it's ready for surfacing and look deving, right? So you will see in here in the scene graph, we have all the geometries. And let's start from the head first. So we're gonna create the instance of this macro. And all we need to fill in here is what kind of object I'm trying to surface. In this case, it could be the head. And you're going to see that automatically there was a material created and assigned. And also, which is very important later, when you're actually doing lighting, you can see that everything has been exposed. All these parameters are going to be exposed when this is published, so you can play with them in your shots if it's needed. We'll get into this a little bit later, how it works internally. So let's create a few more. So if we render now this quickly, let's see what we get. And there we go. I'm not gonna get into the shoes because I have plenty of objects. It's gonna be boring to watch me create more nodes. So basically what you can see here is that I haven't browsed any files. I haven't done any of that. And these nodes, all they did based on naming conventions and a few expressions, they just know where the textures are, how to pick them up and apply them to the character or to whatever asset you're working with. This works for pretty much any asset in the project because, as I said before, it's all based on naming conventions. It's not very difficult to do. We can get into it now. Let me show you just a little bit. So inside these nodes we have the creation of the material, right? Which it has a default name. This default name is later modified by these nodes in here, just renaming. We merge it with a branch, and here it's part of where the expressions come in very handy. So this is calling basically all the information that we are giving them in here, and also at the top of the node. Sorry. So all those expressions are being basically formed by all of this information that we're giving them. And then the material assigned, as you can see, is basically looking for the assets and the object. Those are the two most important things that you have. If for whatever reason you don't follow that structure, and I have done that before, in this project, you can have the global asset assigned, which means that it's just gonna take the whatever is in the GSVs in here, and you also have a custom, which you can say whatever you want to assign, you can just describe it in here, and it's gonna form the asset in a different, slightly different structure. Those are for the cases where your naming convention is, or it's not that it's not consistent, but maybe you form all your geometries in one way, you name them in one way, and then you figure that you need to surface them together, right? Like for example, if you have a car, maybe you just realize that the whole wheel has to be together instead of having independent materials. So if you want to merge those materials, you can. So let's dive a little bit into the expressions. I know this seems confusing at first, but basically one thing I'm doing that I found very, very useful is using a lot of environment variables where I actually have expressions in them. I'm gonna show you now how they work. And this is very useful because that means that this expression is gonna be global for the whole project, right? That means that if you need to change anything in the paths, how it works, you can do it in one place. Of course, if you are publishing KLFs, you're gonna later have to republish them, right? But you probably have that automated anyway. So let's check that out for a moment. So let's say you create a group in here, right? And you need the light groups. expression just to keep the consistency. So what you can just go ahead and do, if you create your expression, you can go get m. This is for the environment variable. You're gonna put the name of the variable. And what are you gonna get here? You're gonna get in here the exact same string that we were having before, right? So now we want to evaluate this string, and this is what we're gonna do. And this is what you're gonna get. And that path is gonna be consistent throughout the whole project. This is not for textures specifically, it's actually only for light groups. Just because it's easier to show the example like that, because the texture needs some parents. In this case, it needs all of this stuff, so it was just easier to show it like that. Another thing I can show you from there is how the naming convention works. In this case, we have the asset, the object, the side in case you have left or right, and the type, if it's a geometry or not. So here you have an example of how the head worked, right? So you have the character, you have the head, and there is a geo. And on the other hand, you have the texture naming convention, which follows pretty much the same thing, right? It's the asset, it's the object, just like in here. This is exclusive to the texture, and so is this, the map type. And inside of the shaders, what you actually get is a material that by default it brings the base color. In this case, I'm more working with Arnold here, so basically it's all that kind of naming convention, right? You have the base and it's connected to it, you have the roughness and the bump. But if you go inside these nodes, you have all of this stuff. This is a color correct that is basically left there. In case you need to color correct later in the shots, you have a node that is exclusive for that. And inside of here, you're gonna have this user section where you have options. You can load any map that you want, including custom ones. This is gonna come very, very handy, the custom one, when you export from somewhere, some masks or whatever. That is not an actual map type that is considered in between the list, right? So if you have custom maps, that's how you load them. And then you don't have to do anything else. Everything is gonna be coming in properly from the paths. All of that is really, really important for this to work, to keep a naming convention that is consistent, to rename all your files and nodes. For the rest, you can see that all these nodes are gonna be naming themselves correctly. And if you need to put other stuff, like for example, displacement maps, you can just copy these nodes. You come in here, say, do I have the displacement in here? Probably not, so you can just do this. In my case, my naming convention and displacements are called disp. So like that, you're just gonna load the displacement of this asset and from this object, which is the head. Some parts of the path are being generated by the options that you have up in here. Like for example, you have the extension, it could be an EXR or PNG if you have textures that you bought from some texture packages. You have, what else is intervening in the path? Well, the type is the character, the textures is high. This is deprecated because all the textures are high. I'm letting Arnold figuring out the level of detail. Here you have the asset, which is André in this case. So all of that, basically all these expressions that we saw before in here, all these expressions are getting, for example, this is the texture. We're getting the project, which is being defined here. We're getting the assets, which is also defined up in here. And all of these ones are to get the global state variables, the type, which was character in this particular case. And then you have all these ones are looking for the assets that you're specifying in the node. This is a hard-coded part of the paths. And the text resolution, well, every single detail. it's in there. And then we have another environment variable for the ones that are only a single texture, so they don't have UDIMs, right? So in that case, instead of having the UDIM, we have the hard-coded part of the path, because I made all of the textures at least have the 1001, so I could keep the path consistent even if there are no UDIMs. So yeah, that's basically the biggest part of the template and the workflow with these nodes that allow me in a couple of clicks to just have all the colors and all the textures. Well, not all of them, but at least a very, very decent base that I can start on. And then, of course, this is a hero character, so it's gonna have a lot more things. Like, for example, let me show you in the final version of the character. You can see that I have a lot more stuff. This is because I like to keep some control inside of Katana instead of having to paint everything outside and exporting it. So as you can see, we can go very quickly through it. You have the base, right? You have the colors, everything that is getting plugged into the subsurface color. You have a few corrections because I exported a few maps, right? And what I'm doing is I'm using those masks like lips or the inside of the eyes, all those little parts that don't need to be repainted every single time you want to change them. You just color correct them inside. And then there are other, I guess the more complex materials are the cloth, but I think we can go through them in another section of the video because it's more on the texturing side of things. So before we jump into the part of the look dev where we do all the stitching and all this stuff, I wanted to show you what I did with the UVs, which is very important for this kind of setup. So I have plenty of UV sets in there, right? So this UV set is the common one for just painting everything, right? Separating in UDIMs, everything is inside the edges. It's pretty tidy. So this one is the one I use to paint the albedo. And then I have other UVs, like stitches. I have a few of this, which are perfectly straight and completely out of the scale. I mean, they are in scale in between each other, but they are completely out of the scale from the rest of the cloth, because these are gonna exclusively be used for the stitches, right? So this means you can have small stitch in here and actually even repeat the pattern, and it's gonna go all the way up. It's gonna repeat infinitely. And the advantage of doing this is that the resolution is gonna be quite independent from the rest of the cloth. Otherwise, to have a very sharp stitching, you would need to have like a massive amount of UDIMs and a lot of textures, and even then that might not hold up in close-up stages. That's going to be deprecated for another kind of workflow that is going to be shown pretty soon by some friends that are developing the cloth that is actually done all with curves. But for now, for this project, it was pretty cool the fact that I could separate the stitching from the texture, from the general texture. And let me show you where this belongs to, right? So you can see this part of that part of the shirt is pretty big, and then you have all these parts, right? All of them that need a lot of resolution for the stitching. Same for this part, and then you have several of this. You have these ones as well, because you need the verticals and the horizontal ones. What else do we have? Well, the pockets are in a different one. You have to separate them by different types, right? For example, if you have different kind of stitching in here than you have in here, the pockets have different stitching than you get in the sleeves, for example. And yeah, you keep separating them into its own type of stitching, and you keep having a few UV sets to play with later on inside of Katana. Now we're gonna jump into Nuke to create a few textures. I mean, you can do this anywhere, but I feel pretty comfortable dialing basically values for displayment maps inside of Nuke. It was pretty easy to do that. This is very exaggerated, so you can actually see it, but the actual output looks more something like this, right? So we exaggerate it so we can see it, and we can see that, for example, in the red channel, I'm using it for purely displacement, right? This is going to generate all the stitches that you're gonna see later. This is gonna generate all the wrinkles around the stitches and around the edges of what should be the garments, right? And in the blue channel, we're gonna have the masks for the actual stitches, which is gonna be useful later for the actual color of each of those. So now if we jump back into Katana, we're gonna get into the shirt, and we're going to get into here, which is, it looks pretty chaotic, but let me explain you a little bit what this is. Each one of these nodes, it contains one of the maps that I exported from Nuke, and each one of these are basically UV transform, which we are moving around to make it match exactly where we want the stitches to be. And then we are also specifying in which UV set they should be acting at, right? So if you see a render from this output, this is the output of the whole thing for the color and the displacement. But let's put it here in the surface so we can see it pretty quickly. We're just layering all those nodes, all these transforms. We are inputting all the stuff in the layer nodes in an overlay mode, so the colors mix properly. So if you just render this quickly, we're going to isolate the shirt. So this is the basic result. I'm gonna lower this a little bit so it's more visible to the eye. So basically what we're seeing here is all our maps that we saw in Nuke before. You're gonna see, let's cancel this render, it's making everything pretty slow. You're gonna see the red, this is the displacement. You can see that there are some wrinkles around the stitching. You can see that the resolution is pretty high and is not constrained by the rest of the UVs because it has the exclusive UV sets that I showed you before. It's a little bit laborious to set this up like this, but afterwards you're gonna see that it's really worth it because you're gonna have results pretty much like this, right? You can see right in here how you have a lot of details in the stitches themselves, in the displacement around. And I think it's worth the work. The same thing has been applied to the t-shirt in here. All of that is displacement, so it's pretty cool to see it when it turns around and everything. You can see that it's displacing the actual geometries, and it's pretty sharp in details. So that's basically how I set up the stitching. It's a bit laborious, but it's worth it at the end. And these are a few of the masks that I export later to use with Katana. Like for example, if I want the cheeks or the forehead to have a little bit more roughness, or to be darker or lighter, or any of that, I can just go ahead and use these masks. Same with these ones. If you can see, the interiors or the eyes are also masked in another channel. And then you have things like the lips, the exterior of the ears, and the interiors. I'm using this as a mask later on just to figure out where I want more or less bump in the face, which is always helpful. I found this very helpful to not having to come back and paint back and forth and export and re-render and try. So you can do all of that inside of Katana. I can show a little bit how you actually get into that. This is the shirt. Let's go into the head. So as you can see in here, you have, for example, the subsurface. The inside of the eye is grabbing the mask from the inside, color correcting it, and then it goes into the material. You can do the exact same thing with other masks just to modify the radius of the surface is very helpful. To not have these very reddish areas in thinner parts, especially for my character, which has such thin borders, edges in some parts of the face. Okay, so that's basically how I went about creating this character. It's been a while. It took me quite a bit to figure out a couple of details, among them all the clothing, the grooming, displacements and simulations and all that stuff. I expect soon to be doing some in-depth tutorials, especially for all the technical parts, all the technical side, and maybe some lighting and compositing work. So for the time being, this is the overview about the character. Thanks a lot for watching.